Today we're doing a slower, more considered sketch of this amazing town, Medellin in Colombia. This reference is from Unsplash and you can find it linked down below. You can also find down below another video featuring this scene where I compare a quick sketch, a medium sketch and this slower sketch. And with this slower sketch, I'm going to talk to you about the advantages of sketching more slowly, taking a more considered approach. And you can already see that happening. I am, believe it or not, for regular viewers of my channel, that is right, I'm using a pencil. So normally I just come in, I jump in with ink and I say, whatever happens, happens. But there are times when it can be nice and relaxing, enjoyable to use a pencil. What I'm actually using is a watercolor pencil. So this is a burnt umber or burnt sienna pencil by Derwent. And that gives us the advantage we don't need to rub it out. If we go wrong or whatever, we can just wash it away when we add our colours. Now the reason I'm doing that, particularly in this scene, is because I want it to be a little more accurate. And look at all of those details. It's a very shape-based scene. All of these concrete houses, these brick houses, are very square, or they've got little slight angles to the roofs. But there's a lot of them. They're overlapping in all sorts of different ways, all sorts of different perspective going on with their slightly different orientations. And all of these things mean that actually for me, for a longer sketch, a tiny bit of planning could be a good idea. So hopefully what you can see is I'm sort of building out those details. Firstly, getting the horizontal lines in. So the horizontal lines would be the top of the house, the top of the roof. And then underneath that, you can get these vertical lines in. So you can start to find where are the walls, where are the sort of poles which are holding up some of the canopies which these houses have. I'm also adding the trees, the bushes in with nice little swirly marks. Some of the windows can come in, but we don't need all of those. We can decide on those later. And one thing you may notice that I'm doing is comparing shapes to other shapes. So trying to get, for example, this house the right size, I'm looking up and down. So where should each house overlap the house above it? Have I gone too wide? Have I gone too narrow? And by doing that, by comparing our measuring, we tend to be able to get a accurate, or at least relatively accurate kind of drawing. And just like that, only takes a few minutes. We've got the bare skeleton of our scene in, and I can come back in with my pen. So the pen I'm using today is the one I've been using a lot recently, my Platinum 3776 with an ultra extra fine nib. Now, as you can see, this nib can be very fine. So with these marks I'm making right now, these vertical marks, they are very, very fine, like a 0.1 or 0.2 mil fine liner. But because it's got a lovely flexible nib, look at the bold lines I can get. You might be able to hear some of that scratching as well. It's got a lot of feedback because it's such a fine nib, but it's very flexible. So we can create this wide variety of marks. And having a quite bold and quite strong set of marks in a scene like this, where it's all about shapes, is quite helpful for building that scene up. I don't want to lose what makes my art mine, that kind of slightly loose abstract feel. So the lines are bold but not completely straight. I'm not using a ruler and I've done it all freehand and there's mistakes in there for sure. But we're still taking a different, more considered approach, which is a great thing you can do if you've got a longer time to sketch. It can be very relaxing just to change up your sort of sketching speed and see how that impacts your style and the things that you actually find within your scene. For me, the focus here, like normal though, is still shapes. So look, as I'm moving around, I'm just finding window shapes. I'm finding house shapes. All these things are basically just, like I said before, basically just squares. Simple squares. And I'm not over focusing in one area at a time. So what we don't want to do is draw the entire of one house, all of its windows, all of its bricks, because then we'll have a huge amount of ink in one area and we're going to have to do all of that inking everywhere to make the image feel balanced. You can't sort of just do a huge amount of detail in one area of your page and leave everything else basically as a skeleton framework, because the eye will be so drawn to the imbalance. So for me, even when, or perhaps especially when you're sketching slowly, it's important to have this approach where you move around. You do a bit here, a bit there, being aware because you have all that time, you can come back later. An example of perhaps overworking it early would be, do you see that little black mark that I've made just there? And then these windows and little parasols I'm adding in. Can your eye see anything else on the page? I mean, obviously it can see something, but when you look, do you feel your eye being drawn to that corner? So there's too much detail there too early for me. Not a big mistake, something I recognised as I'm drawing it and started just going, well, I should move on. And that's where I started moving on to these cables and wires and things, which again, I was able to draw in relatively accurately because of the time we've got. Able to look, where do they intersect these different buildings? Where do they appear from? Where's the next one? How do they link together? And by doing that, gradually we're building up the whole flow through the whole scene, instead of just having a overworked area or a bit which has too much going on, too many things going on. So with that in mind, we're moving on to some of these trickier areas where we no longer just have buildings. We've got trees, we've got other non-man-made objects. So it's really important for me and my style to make it obvious that these are different. The texture is fundamentally different. And with a fundamentally different texture comes a different texture to our line. So notice how my little trees are slightly loopy, slightly angular, pokey, hopefully giving that suggestion of trees, of leaves, of texture which isn't smooth, concrete wall. We're then coming back and just continuing to work around slowly. In the video where I compare quick and slow scenes, the quickest scene I did was capturing basically that silhouette. And it's interesting watching myself sketch back that even when I'm sketching very slowly, I really did focus on the silhouette of the scene before coming down and doing the other details. And I think it's important to recognise when you're sketching what is the important part of the scene. So although this is a slower sketch, I still very much consider this a sketch. I do not want to tell the whole story. I don't want this to be a totally finished piece of art. It's not going to be like an acrylic painting when we get every block of colour in. It's not going to be like an oil where we spend a long time blending and moving the colours around. This is the essence of the scene. So when we are seeking not to overwork, when we're seeking to have a sort of spontaneous feeling sketch, it's important to recognise what about this scene is interesting. So if you take a minute to think for yourself, just looking at the reference, what do you think is interesting? And for me, I've been talking about it already, but it's that silhouette. The silhouette tells the story. And then the other key bit is all of these overlapping shapes. And that is what we spent nearly 10 minutes doing so far. Just those two features. Not the details, not an in-depth look at the textures, not getting all the bricks in. We haven't touched on the colours yet. We've focused on the key bit, spending our energy and our effort, getting the bit that feels key for me, because this is my piece of art. That's what feels key for me. To capture this scene. Be very interested in the comments to hear from other people. If you had a go at this, or if you just want to have a sort of thought experiment, what do you think is the key part of this scene? What is for you the bit that you would focus on, both in the sketching stage, like now, in the drawing stage with ink or with pencil, and also later when we come to the colours? I'd be really interested to hear what's important for you. Now we could call the scene done. We've got those key bits in, or at least what I would consider the key bits. And I'm kind of moving on to a separate stage. The big shapes are done. And this is what I'll tentatively call, as part of my normal 5-step process. Step 1 is shapes, we've done that. Step 1.5 is little shapes and textures. So here I'm looking around and I'm finding some of the windows. I haven't done them in pencil because I didn't know how many I want. I didn't know how it would feel when I'd finished the ink lines. But now I'm finding some of the windows, some of the details, perhaps some of the textures, finding and correcting some lines. By adding those bolder lines, you're also implying shadow, which is where we will come in with some simple things like hatching shortly as well. Hatching adds texture, adds interest, and also it shows shadow, creates contrast. We can see lots of the windows are dark inside, so that's a really safe place to start with our hatching to see if it works. We know those windows are dark. If we squint at the scene, we can see some of the darkest areas jumping out at us are in fact those windows. But important not to get sucked into doing too much of one thing. I wasn't sure about the windows. Again, it's that pulling the eye in a little bit too much for me, a little bit too much. So I'll move away and start somewhere else, having a look at different details, different small shapes. So a few more windows, trying to balance out the level of detail, trying to find the things going on in the scene, finding windows which maybe now that I'm more certain, I can increase the boldness of the line. And then we can go, you know what, I like that hatching. Now that we've got that balance of windows, we've got that balance of detail through the scene, we're not just drawing the eye to two random black squares in the middle of buildings. Now we have lots of other context. And we can start increasing the density of ink in other ways. So just in a few places we can find little brick marks and then jump on again. It's not about overdoing one feature, it's about moving gradually around the scene to avoid overworking. And hopefully you can tell that's a really big theme of this sort of slower style. This slower, more considered form of sketching isn't about getting stuck in one area. I think I've said it about 5 or 6 times in different ways so far. It's not about getting stuck in one area. It's about doing a little bit here, taking a proverbial or even a real step back and going, where else needs something? To keep this image balanced, where else needs something? If you wanted to go for 3 hours, you could keep doing this, and eventually perhaps all the bricks on all the houses would be done. Every single window in perfect, realistic value and contrast. But if you want to do it like I like doing it in incomplete style, you do it for half an hour, do it for 45 minutes, and gradually you build up that kind of level of detail that you feel comfortable with. But by jumping around, you don't unbalance it anywhere in particular. And you can see I'm going from hatching to making some lines bolder, to adding new little details, to making some lines I already made bolder, even bolder. This is all just looking at the balance of the image and kind of trying to create that focal point. So hopefully you can see what's emerging is a stronger contrast on the left side of the image and towards the front, whilst at the top and the back, which is further away from us, we are having a much lower contrast. I'm not going to leave it as totally low contrast. We'll come in there, we'll add a few more details, increase a little bit of the ink, but we do want to create a focal point. So whilst I'm talking about jumping around in all different places, adding details in all different places, gradually you'll work out the key area that you want to pull people's eye towards. That might be the most interesting area of the reference or the scene you're sat in front of. It might not be the most interesting area, but the area you want to make most interesting, that you want to bring the focus towards. There are lots of ways to do that, and that includes bold lines, includes details, includes hatching. But hatching can also be used like this. So this is some very fine hatching, which is actually seeking to push things back. So hopefully you can feel where I've done this fine hatching, it makes things feel distant. It gives them a slight shadow. It simplifies them because all this vertical hatching just makes it look like a very flat scene, whilst also adding some interest and showing how we've achieved this. It's very much a technique you do with pen or perhaps with etching. So it makes the textures we're using part of the artistic process. These textures do not exist on the page, in terms of the reference rather. So these linear hatch shadows are very much an artistic invention. They're not real, and yet they work. Or at least for me, they work. You can see here, you can also build up the shadow with bold lines. So there I did a little bit of hatching and a bold line. That's two ways of gradually building up the shadow. And I've really moved on at this point to applying shadows with my textures. I'm finding the quite specific areas of shadow today. Often I'm very loose with my shadows. I let them flow and jump around and then just see what happens, or perhaps even invent a light source and base all my shadows around that. But today, hopefully you can tell, I've been fairly specific about copying the shadows which really are there in our reference. They're not all there yet. I'll add a few more as we keep going. It's the same idea of jumping around, not doing too much, and we can always come back. And with that in mind, it is time, in fact, to jump in with our colours. So, with our colours, I'm going to start, again, nice and loose. I always say loose colours, and that's no different when I'm taking a much longer time over the sketch. In fact, rather than being no different, it's perhaps even more important. We have a lot more time to apply our colours today. We don't need to therefore jump in and get them really intense first. Watercolours, and this is my absolute biggest tip about watercolours, watercolours are designed to layer up. That means that as you do 2, 3, 4, 5 layers of your watercolours, you will increase the hue sort of tone. So the less of the white paper comes through and more of the pigment gets seen. So you get a bolder and bolder red or a bolder and bolder green on the page now. It also means you get the effect of shadows. The worst thing you can do, in my opinion, with watercolours is try and achieve really strong shadows and really strong contrast straight away. That's the biggest weakness of quick sketching. You almost always do a quick sketch and then you need to add another layer of colour or something else to create contrast. Today, what we're doing is we're starting very light and very gentle. We're mixing our colours a little more than usual, either in the palette or on the page like here, to try and get colours which more closely represent what's in our reference. But we're not focused on jumping in too fast to getting accurate value, accurate shadow. I'm also able to use my flat brush today. The reason I'm using the flat brush is because, as I was talking about earlier, what's key for you in this scene? Well, for me, I said it, the horizon or the silhouette, but also these sort of cuboid stacking shapes. And what better to accentuate or exaggerate these cuboid stacking shapes than to use a cuboid brush. A big flat brush will give us lots of flat brush marks. A little bit like the hatching. The hatching is something which isn't real, it's not in the scene, but it helps the scene. So here, the flat brush marks, they are a painterly feel, the idea of showing the process of painting. They're not part of the scene, they're not real, but they do help explain the scene because they are fitting with a key feature of the scene. So it's useful to think about your tools and how you're using them and consider, is there a way you might adapt your tools, in this case me using a flat brush, adapt your tools to a scene that you are wanting to draw, to sketch, to paint. Here applying some shadows a little early, but they're very light. So rather than shadows, you can just think of these as the initial hue. The hue, which in this case is a neutral-ish hue, it's indigo and quinacridone and sienna, and that neutral-ish hue is able to start to suggest where the shadows might be, a bit like the ink hatching, but it's not really increasing the value. To really get those shadows, we're going to have to come back and do another layer. And again, I stress that is my biggest tip for watercolours, especially when we're taking more time, is to remember you have time to layer them up. You do not have to achieve your perfect colours straight away. In this slightly slower process, so normally I split my colours up into loose colours and bold colours. And the reason for that is, number one, to remind people to come in layers, and number two, to remind me to come in layers so that I get that contrast. An advantage of sketching a little bit slower is we can be a little bit more fluid with that process. So many of these houses will pretty much be dry by now. So in reality, I've probably been painting for maybe not quite 10 minutes with a couple of little bits of meandering around that I've cut out from the video. And that means many of the parts of the page are dry. So I could actually combine my first layer and my second layer of colours if I wanted to. So I could both be applying those really light and loose colours whilst also coming in and in places just enriching and providing that second tone. And I will do a little bit of that shortly, but you'll also see it's not as effective as if we really let things dry and then come in later and really get a controlled feel. What I'm gradually doing though is building in those, it's not really darker values here, but it's those more neutral tones. So I started with our really light colours. I started with those light greens, reds, yellows, really lovely bright tones. And I've moved on much more to indigos and siennas mixed with indigos, which create these deeper shadows. And I have got slightly thicker paint. So instead of layering, you can achieve slightly darker areas with slightly thicker paint. That's part of what I'm doing here. And now we really are moving on to just adding value. We're adding those bolder colours. And look, just by applying a second layer of that colour, I have got a little bit of indigo actually in my green. This initially was mostly green gold. Got a little bit of extra indigo in there just to add a different hue and a slightly deeper shadow. But we've firmly moved on now to really enriching our colours, making those shadows start popping out through a second layer, layer number 2 of our colours. You can see moving around again, similar to the ink. We don't want to overwork anywhere, so we need things to sort of flow, and we need things to not be too oppressive in one area, too bold in one area, and just moving around, touch a bit here, touch a bit there, is really important. This also means, as well as not overworking one area, we'll probably leave that lovely white space. Now we don't need loads of white space, but there's lots of just room to breathe. If you leave some white paper, something unsaid, this is after all a sketch, not a totally complete work of art, you'll get a lot of space and you'll increase the contrast. Notice how much darker these shadows appear when they are next to a white area. And that is quite simply because of how our eyes sort of see and how our brain interprets what our eyes see. We don't tend to actually see the exact darkness. Something which is really dark will actually appear very light if it's next to something even darker. We see relative light and dark. You can try this out at home by looking at different objects in different lights. And you'll find sometimes they appear really light and sometimes they appear different, really dark, depending on the ambient light and the things that they're around. And you can try this with your colours. You can draw a block of yellow next to red, a block of yellow next to black, a block of black next to red, and see how the different colours feel different in those different lights. Hopefully you've been able to see as I'm moving around, we gradually have started really significantly moving on to increasing the kind of tone, the value of the colours in our scene, just through little dibs and dabs here and there. And to give myself a break, we can move on now to the sky. We need this page to dry. Anything else is just going to be very soft and loose. I might lose that nice geometric painterly feel. So instead, I'm going to come in and splish and splash my sky around. Again, using this brush, the same flat brush. Same flat brush is going to give me those same painterly flat marks, which makes the whole image feel unified. It makes it all feel of the same style. Now, normally I love these blooms, and I still love these blooms, but in today's sketch, we're trying to keep that geometric feel. So where I get a little bloom, I use my smaller brush, nice and clean and dry, use my smaller brush to lift out that bloom of colour. That was a bloom of quinacridone coming into my cobalt sky. And then I can move on. And then very foolishly, what happens here? I get another bloom. So I do the same process again, this time thinking, oh, what a silly bean. But it's very simple, just to come in, nice and clean brush, mostly dry, not totally dry, but mostly dry. And then you can normally just touch in a little bit of the original colour on top and it will feel okay. There's still a little bloom there. That's because I couldn't completely remove it without, I felt, overworking that bit. But it's not as bad and uncontrolled as it was before. And with that, we can now bring our little brush into the action. So this is not a round brush, but we can use the side of it to keep that geometric feel. And this is where I'm using really thick paint to create real contrast in places. So it's the same colours I'm using, but you can see how much more punch they have. And you can hopefully see how, by applying these deep shadows, other areas appear brighter. And we get a lot more shape and just more drama. And again, normally in my sketching videos, I show you that by now I'd be restructuring with ink. But there's something different in this sketch. Now in this sketch, I haven't covered up many of the ink lines. So although watercolour is transparent, so it's not opaque, so unlike acrylic or gouache, if you paint over lines with watercolour you can see them, but it does take away from their deep black intensity. Now, because I spent a while focusing on making some lines really bold, some really fine, because I've been painting quite specifically, at least for me, I know this is still definitely on the loose side for many people, but for me, I've been painting quite specifically within shapes. Hopefully not paint by numbers. I've been thinking about keeping it painterly, not just blocking in shapes, but making it interesting, but still not covering over those lines. Then I don't actually feel the need to immediately jump in and add more structure with my pen. Now there's certainly an argument to say that you could do that. There's no problem with it. But I think more important is to continue to build up those layers. Again, we're being delicate and we can see how using this smaller brush, we really are able to get a much darker layering effect, much more specific, and really continue to build the drama, the interest in the scene. And again, like with the ink, move around, jump around, go from one place to another, find what's missing, find where it could be improved, but then move somewhere else and balance out the scene. That's what I'm attempting to do and hopefully what I'm achieving, at least to some extent. And I do think this is coming together quite nicely. And with that, I'm actually very almost done. We could keep going for hours. We could, just like with the pen, we could have added detail after detail. We could paint all these little specific details. But it's also important to, for me, keep it light and loose. Keep it suggestive. I have one more little play at the end, just adding a few bits of pencil mark back in. Instead of restructuring with pen, just a few little scratchy marks with the same watercolour pencil. But I do that after, of course, signing both my initials and hiding my signature somewhere in the image. If you enjoyed this slightly slower, more considered version of sketching, then let me know and I'm happy to produce even more tutorials like this. And don't forget to check out my other video where I compare this style directly with a much faster, looser sketching style in the same scene. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.